The JFK assassination. How many times have you heard that phrase? I've heard it a lot. I live in Dallas, Texas. And what really happened on that day in Dallas, Texas? Let's look at that. Hi, I'm Rohrich Knose. I'm a board-certified plastic surgeon in Dallas, Texas, and I came to Dallas in the 80s, and I was the chief of plastic surgery for a long time at Parkland Hospital and UT Southwestern. And what we did on the 50th anniversary is we reassessed the medical data on the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And so do we really know what happened on that fateful day at 12:30 on Friday afternoon on November 22nd, 1963, when John F. Kennedy flew here from Fort Worth, Texas, and then was assassinated in an open motorcade in downtown Dallas, and then was pronounced dead 30 minutes later at Parkland Hospital? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that it was a beautiful day. It was a crisp day when he landed at Love Field, and it was amazing, you know, from the moment that he landed to the moment that he came to downtown Dallas in an open motorcade, the last open presidential motorcade ever in the history of the United States, and then to be shot and assassinated and pronounced dead 30 minutes later in Parkland Hospital is truly unbelievable. And yet those events that day changed America. It changed who we believe in, who we trust, who we really understand. And is the Warren Commission report really accurate, or are there some missing facts? Is it the one-shot theory really important? Well, let's look at this. Let's look at the Parkland scenario. And I was fortunate when I was asked to discuss this in a major craniofacial meeting in the late 80s, early 90s. I got to interview a lot of the physicians that were still at Parkland. Some of them have deceased since then. You know, Doctors Carrico and Baxter, Perry, McClelland, Doctors Jones, Peters, Pepper Jenkins, and Giesecke. All these were famous people that were surrounding this whole arena on that fateful day. And so what really happened? So when he arrived at Parkland Hospital at 12:30, it was truly unbelievable event, because they took the president out of the rumble seat and over the governor, Governor Conley, who lay there bleeding with a sucking chest wound. They brought him into trauma room bay 1. And I interviewed all of these physicians, some of the key physicians. Dr. Carrico, who was the chairman of Dr. Carrico was the chairman of surgery at that time. But the gentleman that actually had the most clearest and vivid memory of all, who never changed his mind at all, was Dr. Robert McClelland, who was an amazing general surgeon at that time, and he was a junior surgeon at that time, and he was there. And so when they assessed him, he didn't have a pulse or blood pressure. His pupils were fixed and dilated. Dr. Carrico put an endotracheal tube in. They began IVs in his right leg, and then they put in, and they saw that he had agonal respiratory efforts, and so he still had heartbeats, but they were occasional, and he had external wounds both on the anterior neck and then also a big wound in the back of the head, a large one with brain tissue coming out of it. And so in those critical 30 minutes, they put an endotracheal tube, they did a tracheostomy, they did an IV, they type and cross-matched them. They did a tracheostomy because they thought they had, that even though they had an endotracheal tube in, that he wasn't getting adequate breathing. So they put in some chest tubes, where they put these tubes in to make sure that the lung is ventilated. They did CPR. They started another IV, and they put in steroids in his IV because he had previous history of Addison's, which was a steroid deficiency. And so all these things happened, and they were doing all these things, and then finally the chief of neurosurgery, Dr. William Kemp Clark, who was watching this and saw that the pupils were fixed and dilated, the cardiac, that the cardiac, well, there was no cardiac response, and he was profusely bleeding from the back of his head, and he had a huge piece of cerebral tissue on the cart, a 3 by 3 centimeter piece. And he said, "Gentlemen, the president is dead." And that was at 1 p.m. that day. So everything stopped. The cardiac resuscitation stopped. Everything stopped. Mrs. Kennedy came in to see him. And according to Dr. McClelland, she took a ring from her finger and put it on his, and took his ring and put it on her finger, and left. And it was then that things changed. They did everything they could, but he was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Dallas time in that 30-minute period. So the Parkland scenario was that the body was then released to the medical examiner, Dr. Earl Rose. And however, Mrs. Kennedy said, "We are not leaving Dallas without the president's body." So the body was forcibly removed from Parkland, and Dr. Rose, who apparently was standing in the door, was moved by the Secret Service, and they took the body, which was now in an expensive casket, and they took it to the plane at Love Field. And then 8 hours later, at about 7 to 8 p.m., a autopsy was done by Dr. Commander James Humes at the U.S. Navy, who really had not done that many autopsies, certainly not of the caliber of President Kennedy, but he was in the Bethesda Naval Hospital. And of course, President Kennedy was in the Navy. And all of the x-rays and photographs were taken by the U.S. Treasury Department. And interestingly, no bullet was found on the body. And of course, the assassin, and this is part one of at least 2 or 3 parts on this chronology of the medical data. The assassin was fairly early identified as Lee Harvey Oswald, who had purchased this Italian 6.5 millimeter Carbano rifle mail order for $19.95. And so that was the alternative scenario. And of course, as this all unfolded, the Warren Commission eventually was formed, and then in about 6 months, it was headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren, who published 27 volumes, but really the major summary volume was the one that was publicly available. And there were some things that were perhaps not totally accurate in that. Some material was withheld, and things were not really published. And some of the members that were on this committee were Representative Gerald Ford, who became President Ford, and Alan Dulles, who had just been fired as the head of the CIA after the Bay of Pigs incident, and various other individuals. So the summary of that data, surprisingly, was that it was 3-shot theory. The first shot missed. The second shot hit Kennedy, the magic bullet, and Connally, and it hit Kennedy in the back of the neck and came out in the front of the neck and hit Governor Connally in the right side of the back, tore through his chest wall, hit him in the right wrist, and ended in his left thigh. Now, figure that out. It's a magic bullet. So if you look at that, even today with computer imagery and computer graphics, it's hard to imagine a magic bullet doing all of those things, going through multiple chest cavities and being unfrayed, and to come out, to go down in one area and then in the thoracic area, come out and pop up to the area, the cervical area, and then come out and go through the chest wall of the guy in front of you, which happened to be the governor, come out through his chest wall, go through the wrist, and go to the left thigh. It's hard to believe that. So even though he was in the rumble seat behind, in front of the president, you can see that when Jack Kennedy was hit, you could see Governor Connally say, "Jack, are you okay?" So how could he have been shot with that same bullet? It's hard to imagine that. But that was the theory. And that the third shot hit the president in the head and shattered the right side of his brain. And of course, the autopsy does not really show that as much as a exit wound in the back of his head. So there are multiple unanswered questions. One is the size and site of the skull and the neck wound, and then the pristine bullet, and then the whole discrepancy between the Parkland doctors and the autopsy, because they were never consulted. And then the autopsy was not totally done completely like a normal autopsy. And then there was all kinds of x-rays and photographs that were withheld. And then, of course, there's the Zapruder film. So all of these are part of the National Archives. And the summary volume of the Warren text really wanted to kind of put this to bed. I think there was a lot of turmoil in America at that time. We were getting deep into the Vietnam War. There was a lot of turmoil in the United States. And what he wanted to do was to have the Warren Report restore faith in the American government. And I think it long-term has done the opposite. Because what you can see from the autopsy was that there was a lot of discrepancies, from the bullet wound in the back to the exit wound, presumably right where the tracheostomy was done, to how that possibly ever could have been the same bullet that then went into Connolly's chest wall and into his wrist and his left thigh. It's almost unfathomable how that could be sold as the magic bullet theory, but yet it was. And of course, the bullet was never found, except it was found on a Parkland gurney, and it was this pristine bullet. It looked like it had never been through anything. And many ballistic tests have tried to reproduce that, and the bullets are very, very much more marred up after going through so much substance of human bones and structures that the pristine bullet doesn't make any sense. So the magic bullet theory, to me, is pure, I think it's pure nonsense that could even be possible. And then there was the discrepancy between the Parkland doctors and the autopsy. It was very clear that the Parkland doctors were told that this is how it's going to play, because every one of them changed their minds from when they all thought it was that fatal shot from the front that hit the president in the right forehead and blew out the back of his right forehead and occipital area. And the only physician that, to his death, never changed it was Dr. Robert McClelland. And you can see that in a video that I did with him on the 50th anniversary in 2013. I did a 3-part video, and please look at it on YouTube, and you can see he always said that when he was helping putting the tracheostomy in, he could see the back of JFK's head, and the brain, parts of the brain fell out, and it was a large defect. And to his deathbed, he always acknowledged that. He never changed his mind. And those of you who knew Dr. McClelland, he was honest as the day is long. And he had a pictorial representation of this that's I'm going to share with you, that showed this huge defect. This is not an entrance wound. This is an exit wound. And really, multiple pieces of the skull were found on the pavement at the site of the assassination days later. And there's a piece of his occipital bone which was found there as well. It was 3 by 3 centimeters. And you can see that. And that fits into the back of the occipital area. And the autopsy report, again, had to be redone, apparently, after it was done. And so there are multiple discrepancies on that as well. And then the incompletion of the x-rays and the photographs that couldn't tie it together. So, but, you know, the goal was clear, to make it a 3-shot theory, and that was the principal objective, and that the lack of this other material really didn't seem to matter. And so the autopsy summary from Dr. Hume said that there was an entry bullet that entered the skull in the right occipital area, traversed the cranial cavity, exploded into the right parietal bone, and produced extensive skull fragments and cerebral hemisphere laceration. And yet that didn't really seem to play out when you looked at these photos of the autopsy. and that the other wounds were part of the second shot which was the magic bullet. And so I would say that when Dr. Humes presented this, and that the president died from 2 gunshot wounds of high velocity projectiles fired above and behind the deceased, were things that actually echo hollow today. I think that when you look at the medical data, when we looked at it objectively and interviewing again at that time the doctors that were still alive, especially Dr. McClelland, there was a lot of contradiction. And recently, the Biden administration has released thousands of pages of more documents which have implicated other groups, including the CIA, that actually may have not been so forthcoming in providing evidence that would have helped us clarify what really happened on that fateful day in November in Dallas, Texas. And I think the other thing that's really, really telling is the Zapruder film. The Zapruder film was taken by a gentleman that was right there in Dealey Plaza, and he happened to be taking it. And it really does show amazingly, and this is part of the National Archives, and Oliver Stone showed this over and over again when he did his movie on JFK, and really just showed how after everything happened, everybody ran upward to the picket fence because that's where they thought shots were fired. And yet someone apparently was there saying, I've got this area covered. So we do know that President John F. Kennedy sustained a mortal cranial gunshot wound that was fatal at the scene. There was no way he could even today have been recovered. And that, there's more and more ongoing evidence that actually, that fatal shot was not part of the magic, theory, the magic 3-shot theory, and that potentially the secret still lies in this Zapruder film. And when you look at the Zapruder film, you can see very clearly that the second shot was the one where President Kennedy brought his arms up, and Connally did not get shot with that shot. That was the second shot. In fact, he came in and he looked around and he said, "Jack, are you okay?" And so that does not fit the magic bullet theory. And then, of course, the final shot, which as he was leaning forward was, I think, a forward shot, a front shot, just like Dr. McClelland said, because that's what it showed when he saw this huge hole in the back of his right head. And that's the shot that actually was taken that literally blew his brains out. And that's one of the many reasons why I think Jackie saw his brains out on the side of his head and took off on the back of the car. And of course, then it sped to Parkland Hospital. And, we will really never truly know what I think really happened on that fateful day in Dallas. But I think as more and more evidence becomes released, and I think there's supposed to be another cadre of evidence released in the next couple of years, we will probably know that there was a lot more involvement than just a lone assassin. But for now, it remains an unsolved mystery. So stay tuned for part 2 when I talk about how the Zapruder film truly can unlock some of this evidence from the National Archives. So please give me your comments and thoughts as we move forward, I think, on this very, very challenging part of American history as we unveil what really happened in Dallas on that fateful day, November 22nd, 1963.